to our news conference on what to expect here at the G20 Leaders Summit in Brisbane, Australia in 2014. We have three experts with us from think tanks, research institutes, and they'll be taking questions after some brief opening statements about what to look for and how to read the communique. On my immediate left is Thomas Bernes, a distinguished fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, an independent, nonpartisan think tank based in Waterloo, Canada, but with a network of fellows all around the world, including in Asia, the United States, North America, across North America, in Europe, and other places. Also with us is Bessma Momani. She is a professor at the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow with CIGI. And John Kirton, who is co-director and founder of the G20 Research Center, which is based at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Tom Bernes.
Okay, thanks, Fred. I was speaking to a reporter earlier this morning who said, do we really need help to understand a communique? Isn't it very straightforward? This is the first time I've attended one of these meetings. And I guess for those of us who have been around the game for a while, communiques are an art form, and sometimes they do need help in being interpreted. I think if you look start with the London Summit in 2008, leaders themselves threw away the communique which officials had drafted and drafted themselves around the table, and that communique was very short. It was 2,400 words. When they came out, there was a clear political commitment to undertaking what was in that communique. By the time of the last communique, John and his research institute very carefully calculate how many words there are in these communiques, and it was over 14,000 words, including the annexes that are attached to the communique. And I think, as we all know, sort of, if you can't agree, you add additional language to try and cover what's missing. Australia presidency set out, I guess, two objectives at the start of their presidency. They said we wanted to have a focused agenda on economic growth, and we want to have specifics, and we want to set a specific target of a 2% higher growth trajectory over the next 5 years. I think while the communique will record a lot of progress in a lot of areas where international organizations have followed up, be it the FSB on dealing with too big to fail institutions, whether it's the OECD dealing with tax evasion and avoidance, I think these will all be reflected. But the litmus test, I think, for the summit is the economic growth agenda. And there are two questions: whether the specifics are credible, and we'll see that when the country commitments come out later today, and whether the political backing by leaders is convincing. We've all heard they're going to produce a list of structural reform measures, 1,000 plus, which are designed to provide 2% additional growth. I just recall that this is not new. In 2010, the IMF presented to the G20 three growth scenarios. They said if countries undertook these measures, including a lot of structural reform measures, which would complement each other, growth could be 2.5% higher, with $1.5 trillion more in global GDP and 30 million new jobs. They also presented a baseline scenario and a downside scenario. What happened was, in fact, the downside scenario was what unfolded. In fact, even it was too optimistic. The difference was $4 trillion in global GDP and 52 million jobs. Why did that happen? Part of it was there was no commitment on the part of the political leadership to follow through. This was a nice report by a solid organization, but it didn't reflect the sort of political commitment we saw in London. So this time around, and I applaud the Australians for it, they said countries have to come up with the measures. We have to be specific. And so that's really the challenge. here and the political commitments to be tested. Now, structural reforms are very hard. I mean, we're dealing with sensitive domestic issues here. I mean, it can be Uber taxi in Berlin, in Frankfurt. It can be dairy agriculture protection in Canada. It can be opening Sunday shops in France. I mean, these are things that touch upon tough domestic political concerns. And which is why the IMF and the OECD, which have looked and examined these measures, said, yes, they can provide 2% additional growth if fully implemented. And I think that's the language to watch out for, if fully implemented. As I said, the commitment and the follow-through will be critical. And whether monitoring is put in place, whether there's a process by which countries will take remedial action, whether the leaders demonstrate the political strength of their convictions to deliver on this agenda. I think that's the critical test. One way we will see this is when the IMF and the OECD revise their growth forecasts. As we all know, they've been marked down, marked down, marked down over the last number of years. When they turn around and say we are now revising them because there is effective implementation of these measures taking place, we'll know it's really biting. So, you know, bottom line, don't get carried away by the rhetoric. Hopefully the leaders will keep the rhetoric limited. Specifics of the measures they're committed to taking and demonstrating that political commitment will be the keys. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We'll now take opening remarks from Bessma Momani.
Thank you. As Tom alluded to, you know, there's been a lot of preparatory technical work done primarily by the OECD and the IMF to help the G20 leaders. And the focus has been on a lot of great details, things like competition, tax avoidance, trade, spurring employment. But the one that sounds, I think, most doable and the easiest to implement, frankly, is the infrastructure and investment. And that's really getting back to what we've seen post-2008 financial crisis, this idea of shovel-ready projects. As a political scientist, I think the challenge here is trying to kind of figure out who's going to really take on this big infrastructure spending. Looking at the political landscape, both in terms of the Americans now having dominated Republican Party Congresses, houses, I mean, are they going to be in the ready to build more bridges and roads to nowhere, as infamously said by much of the Tea Party? We have in the UK, Canada, Germany, and Australia governments that are on track to be really fiscal consolidators. They don't want to be spending at this moment. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, left on perhaps the Chinese and the Saudis, who are the sort of two countries in the G20 that I think can really at least claim to have really large coffers. The Chinese, of course, are very much afraid of inflation. I think many Western countries would like them to propose more in terms of spending on the rural side and many of the underdeveloped areas that China needs to really prompt up its infrastructure spending. But the challenge there again is for the Chinese, as many who follow China would know, their great fear of inflation really dominates much of the discussion there locally. And also the fact that corruption has been tied to much of these big development projects that are really taken over the countryside. And one of the key challenges for the Communist Party really is how to curb corruption with all these continued complaints from many of the local people. You know, I think what's interesting and what I think the Chinese will want to do is put on the agenda is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I think is one opportunity to say that they've done a great deal in putting real hard money on the table. That I think will be something they'll want to flag. I don't know if the G20 communique will put that on the or put that in the communique itself. The history of these kinds of bilateral separate banks don't tend to be warmly greeted, let's say that, by many of the Western countries, thinking of the Asian Monetary Fund, thinking of even in the case more recently of the BRICS Bank. All of that, unfortunately, tends to be resisted by many countries in the West. So that'll be very interesting if we do see an AIIB come to fruition. That does say a lot about how much the Americans, or I should say the Chinese, have been able to really sway things. Then also the Saudis, of course, the big problem there is they don't have a lot of absorptive capacity. The region has enough malls and towers. There's not a lot more to build. So then it comes to the big issue of what are we going to do beyond the technical economic front. And that, I think, is really my greatest takeaway from the G20 communique or meeting is really that despite the attempt of the Abbott government to keep this sorely focused on the GDP 2% economic growth, the reality is there's just too many great concerns among the people of the world who really want big issues on the table. So I do think that we are already seeing hints of perhaps that climate change will be on the agenda. I think it's high time. The fact that we've had the U.S. president make it clearly a key part of his Queensland University speech really points to this being an important endeavor, and obviously all of us coming out of APEC with the Chinese and the Americans signing means that we should expect something on climate change in the communique. Whether or not that includes a green climate fund, that's up to debate. Obviously, many countries, many of those conservative governments who, again, don't want to be spending a lot of money will probably be more resistant, and obviously the Abbott government, and I should say the Canadian government as well, would probably be on the list of that. Ebola, obviously, is an important issue. Whether or not it'll make it to the communique, we'll see, but I do think that ideas of allowing the IMF and the World Bank to at least talk about continued write-off of debt as a way perhaps to spur some kind of focus on Ebola, whether it's through the heavily indebted poor countries' debt relief initiatives that we've seen in the past. Tax avoidance is going to be, I think, top on the agenda. That's something that 95% of the countries in the world agree on. It's to no one's benefit to have corporations pay 1 to 2%. It's clearly going to be a top item issue, and short of small countries that promote tax havens, which are not in the G20, this is probably something where there's going to be some common ground. India has made a very big point through this idea of hunting black money. Modi's made this a really important part of his agenda, and I think he wants to go home with this being a high success item. So I do expect some reference to that. Obviously, there will be, I think, some reference to ISIS and fighting terrorism, which I think all G20 members agree on. If not ISIS by name, then talking about fighting terrorism is something that all agree on. Of course, the Americans and many of the Western countries, in response to Putin, will want to, and much of the sort of aggressive stance that the Russians have had towards Ukraine, may want to have something like sovereignty of states on the communique. That might fly, and I'm sure that Putin will take that and go home and say that meant Americans should stay out of Iraq and Syria. But nevertheless, some sort of reference to sovereignty of states is something that I'd expect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bessma. And now we have opening remarks from John Kirton of the G20 Research Group.
Merci, bienvenue. How successful is the Brisbane Summit going to be when we see the results a few hours from now? And given the inevitable disappointments, how well will it set up the Turkish-hosted summit to be held in mid-November next year, and then the Chinese-hosted summit the year after that? Because as of December 1st, these are the three countries that come into the governing troika. On the first, the Brisbane Summit is going to be a summit of significant but selective success. Going to do well on the hardcore economic agenda that they focused on from the start, but do much less well on the bigger, broader agenda that most G20 summits have actively taken up and advanced routinely in the past. On each side of that, the hardcore economic issues, let me focus on a few late-minute additions, leaders, being real leaders, going beyond what those who work for them have done. I think the new momentum behind the commitment on female labor force participation, close the gender gap by 25% by 2025. I think that's an important advance. I think they'll get that one done as well. The other big surprise, which seems to have steam in its sails with President Xi in the lead, is corruption. Yeah, it's the third largest sector of the global economy. It's an important economic issue, but it's also an important political issue, an important security issue as well. They all go together, as they do when leaders alone have to govern back home. I am less optimistic about the famous 2% growth. When it was proudly proclaimed in February, it was 2% above the baseline then. That was 3.6% for the year we're in now. Well, now we know what the real baseline is. It's less. It's 3.3. Now, Tony Abbott, to his credit, in the article he wrote for us, reminded everyone that the commitment was actually more than 2, and 2% is no longer good enough. So we need, if you just do the arithmetic, not 2% in the communique, we need at least 2.3, and even that assumes 100% compliance and implementation. And my colleagues who have become experts on compliance with commitments know you never get 100%. On the other side of the agenda, I was extremely encouraged by the Ebola statement, Ebola. Not just because it's the first time the G20 has taken up global health governance, but because it clearly signaled it would stay in the game in a bigger, broader way, health systems strengthening in general. So it really did prove when leaders get alone together, right? You can throw away the narrow economic playbook and do bigger, bolder things. The language of the communique is important. Yes, they said 5 times, we're dealing with Ebola in order to generate economic growth. But at the beginning they said they're dealing with Ebola because it's a humanitarian issue, a development issue. Oh, and by the way, it has an impact on growth. So they can broaden their horizon as well. Islamic State, the G20 has dealt every summit and every ministerial meeting since the year 2001 with terrorism, terrorist finance. So they really do and should deal with that. Ukraine, that is the big ghost at the banquet. The reality is you can simply not generate growth in Europe unless you get Russian troops out of Ukraine and get Russia to give the Crimean region back to Ukraine over the next 5 years. And if you've been looking at the financial fundamentals, capital flight, bank runs over the past week in Russia, unless you can get Ukraine solved the right way, you could have Russia catalyzing another financial crisis. And the fundamental mission of the G20 was to promote financial stability, to prevent, as well as just respond to, financial crises. So that's at the core of what the G20 is all about. And on the broader agenda, let me just say climate change. In the G20, repeatedly at the leaders level from the start, we have a word for that. It's not CC, it's GG, it's green growth. That's green economic growth. It's been a core part of the economic agenda. So I'm looking to see in the communique if those words, green growth, reappear. Next year to Turkey, Prime Minister Davutoglu has laid out his priorities, a pledge to, yes, carry forward the built-in agenda. So good, Tony Abbott will have an afterlife as we go forward to probably Istanbul. But in outlining his priorities, he said, I'm going to get back to full-strength G20 governance. I'm going to do climate change. I'm going to do development, with a particular focus on the least developed countries. And remember here that the second core mission of the G20, the reason the institution was created and continue, is to make globalization work for the benefit of all. Not just the 1% at the top, but the 1% at the bottom, too. So we're getting back to the basics in Turkey next year. In China, my colleagues at Renmin University have been thinking about this hard, working on it. A lot of good ideas. Let's see if President Xi listens as much as he should to them. But at the moment, I'm encouraged. Clearly, the momentum behind corruption is Mr. Xi's priority back at home. Clearly, I think we see from the BRICS meeting here and other signs that China is indeed taking up its global responsibilities more innovatively, but as a full cooperative partner, not just of a G2 or G5 in the BRICS, but of the G20 as a whole. So I may have to downgrade my forecast by midnight when the communique comes out, but I suspect I'll be giving Brisbane a better grade once we see how Turkey and China give it a boost in the coming years.
Thank you very much, John. So that is the overview from our three global policy experts on what to expect here at the Brisbane G20. I'm now going to open it up to questions. We have runners with handheld mics. They'll come to you, so if you could please wait for the mic. And please help me by stating your name and media affiliation. And so I'll start right here with this gentleman on the aisle.
Andrew Thomas from Al Jazeera English. Could you just clear up the 2% figure? Because there seem to be a lot of people who say that it's 2% more growth. But if it's 2% of the growth already expected, that's very different to saying that the world's economy should be 2% bigger overall in 5 years' time. If you've got some numbers to put to that, I'd be grateful.
All right, now who wants to take that one? And also, if you want to address your question to a specific person, please let me know. But Tom, do you want to start with that?
I mean, the commitment was to increase the growth trajectory from the October 2013 IMF forecast by 2%. So that's, I don't have the numbers here with me, but that's, I'm sure it'll be in the documentation that comes out today, but it's enhancing the growth trajectory path by 2% from that October 2013 level. So even if it has gone down, economic growth, as John has noted, the baseline from October 2013, which was higher, it's 2% on top of that. So what they need to achieve is higher. That's right.
All right. Who's next? Saw your hand up here in the front row.
I'm with the DPA, German press agency, on this growth figure. A lot of countries do have their own growth plans. So does it really need a G20 meeting to come up with a plan like that? Isn't it just the case that the countries just show what they're doing at home and try their best, and then in the end the G20 can claim, oh, we did so much for the world economy?
See, looking at Tom, so we'll start there.
No, I mean, that's a good question. I think that would be one of the tests. What the G20 said is these are to be new measures. They're not supposed to be measures that are already in the books of governments. So that's the first test. Are these, in fact, new measures? Clearly, what was already planned is not providing adequate growth to deal with the unemployment the world faces, the G20 country faces. And so the whole idea behind it was, no, we need new and additional measures. So it's not just, here's what we're already doing, it's here's what we're already doing, and here's what we're going to do in addition. So that's the test. Does that have credibility when it comes out? When I see the results, I'll, when they're released, I'll let you know.
If I can add.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, the IMF and the OECD have said, you know, there's been a screening process over the last few months. And the IMF and the OECD have looked at these. And the first go around, they sent them back saying, one, it doesn't meet the 2% target. Secondly, a number of these measures were already planned and in the books, and so they don't qualify. So their screening is supposed to have said, yes, these are new measures which had not been announced before and which had not been part of government planning before. So we will see.
All right, I think I saw a question. Yes, the lady with her hand up there.
Thank you. I come from CCTV. I would like ask a question for the Bessma and John. And the question is, will there be any new agreement on the carbon emission deal and the tax evasion?
I mean, I think that I don't think that there will be specifics. It seems to be that there's a lot more going to be done on the bilateral part when it comes to carbon emission reductions. But I'm going to just pick up one last, if I could, back to the previous question, if I could. I think we are going to see a lot of recycling of old ideas and initiatives, even though there may be an attempt to, and I think the IMF and the OECD have done a good job of trying to screen it out. The reality is when we have these leaders go back to their political capitals, they're going to say, you know, we've committed to X, Y, Z, and if we dig deep enough, there's probably going to be a lot of replication to what they've already committed to. I've seen that already from the Canadian government, for example. But you ask the question of what's the value of the G20 if they've already committed to these? Well, there is a sense of naming and shaming when you come to these organizations and groupings, in a sense that there is an upmanship, you know, there is a, well, I can do more than that, you know, and so that encourages countries to do beyond what they've committed to. So I think that even though, yes, there will be recycling of old initiatives, I do suspect that the G20 meeting itself serves a purpose of having governments do lay out even more new ideas on the table. So it helps. And I'll let John take the second part
evasion
question.
and carbon emissions, John?
On carbon emissions, the jury's still out, and that discussion is, I think, going to go to the end game. Two possibilities. One is that Tony Abbott will reluctantly add a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph, called climate change, in which they'll say little more than, we love the UN, we trust it, good on you at Lima, and then at the Paris conference. It would be better if you left that out and did nothing at all, because none of these leaders who are at the Copenhagen conference believes that the UN can solve the problem on its own. On the other side, he could at least do his summit, these leaders, what every summit since Pittsburgh 2009 has done, and repeat the commitment and say we're really going to implement it, just one that they've already agreed to, eliminate fossil fuel subsidies by the medium term. But the medium term is coming fast. It's next year or the one after that. If you could just keep that one commitment, and Mr. Abbott, to his credit, has emphasized the importance of implementation, you would cut 10% of your carbon emissions going into the atmosphere. That's a big chunk. And it's not some aspirational ideal in 2030. It's right here, right now, and it's already been agreed to for several years again and again by the G20. You could also save the hard-pressed taxpayers and treasuries of G20 governments and elsewhere about $750 billion each year, because these subsidies are very, very expensive. Ask the new leader of Indonesia, for example. Oh, and the new leader of India as well. You could cut corruption. Wherever you get fossil fuel subsidies, corruption flourishes. Any Nigerian or Mexican and now a Brazilian will tell you that. You could save a lot of lives of mothers and babies who use these poisonous subsidized fuels while they cook at home. Oh, and income inequality, you could help reduce that, because fossil fuel subsidies benefit disproportionately the rich. So just by find a way to implement that one promise repeatedly made, you could do so much good in so many areas. So we're just waiting to see, at least I am, if they do that, just that one thing, rather than add another $3 billion or so to what Barack Obama already put on the table for the Green Climate Fund.
Is it Barry from USA Today, Barry Woods? Okay.
Barry Wood from USA Today. For John, I would like to ask you about Ukraine. It will not be mentioned, is that what I gather from you? And if it's not, then the precedent that was set, I think, in St. Petersburg, where Syria was discussed, is not being replicated here, where a difficult issue has not really come up. That's a step backwards, isn't it? And my second item is more pedantic, but why is Erdogan not here if he's hosting next year's meeting?
He's not the head of state.
Very quickly, you're right about St. Petersburg. last year on the Syrian front. Mr. Putin, who had been at several summits before, proved to be a really adept, a very skilled host. So what at the last moment, many of his partners said, look, we really need to talk about the big burning geopolitical issue of the day, the use of weapons of mass destruction, the chemical ones in Syria. He was smart enough to say, yeah, let's do it, devote the whole dinner discussion to it. And he saw the lay of the land, and then the walk in the woods with Barack Obama, and then in a few days, the deal was done and those chemical weapons are out. If they hadn't been, they would have fallen into the hands of the Islamic State terrorists, be there to kill the Canadian and Australian and American armed forces now arriving there. Mr. Abbott had a choice of saying, look, I know Ukraine is really important for a lot of people. They need to get the message home. Even in the past week or two, as Mr. Putin seems to be doubling down on a destructive course, right? Rather than sending an accommodating move to Tony Abbott, who tried to accommodate him up in Beijing, right, with a little private, non-shirt front talk. But instead what we see is a rather rigid approach. Don't want to spoil the atmospherics. So we've got a lot of discussions bilaterally. And I think by the time they jet out, you will have a European Union, the Big Four, plus the United States summit at G5. Maybe they'll let the Canadians and the Japanese in too to make it a G7 one. And they will get their act together, right? They will do more sanctions. Merkel has signaled that, right? Okay, well, what about Mr. Putin's support club in his own mind? What was really revealing about the BRICS communique is they deliberately decided not to say a single thing that could be construed in any way as a measure of support for Mr. Putin. So I think he's lost his BRICS buddies, and he's on a losing course. That's not the best way to solve it, right? Because it'll take time, I think, for him to realize it. And we may be closer to a new financial crisis out of Russia than that. 400 billion in foreign exchange reserves, even if all of them are in rising US dollars, that can melt down pretty quickly in today's interconnected world. But it's still time to do better. I guess the last session here is about the future. And again, when leaders are alone together, they can talk about anything they want. So Mr. Putin by then might be ready to have a dialogue where his part is not yet again a deep denial. So there's still a chance, right? But the clock is ticking on that.
Let's do the where's Erdogan, and maybe Bessma, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, Erdogan is no longer prime minister. He's now president, which is more of ceremonial. Of course, we know he really wields power, but Davutoglu is technically the prime minister, and he's here.
Okay, next question. I see someone at the back of the aisle here. Lady in blue. Yes.
Hi. Hi, Laura Milan from El País. Just on the tax evasions, it looks like Juncker wanted to push the automatic exchange of tax rulings into the communique. So what's your take on that? And more in general in tax evasion, what are you expecting to see? Any specifics given the last media informations on Luxembourg's and LuxLeaks?
Who'd like to take that? John, go ahead.
Well, I can certainly understand why anyone from Luxembourg would like to now be seen to be in the lead on the tax evasion front. Automatic exchange is now broadly accepted. It's not politically contentious. So I think clearly automatic exchange will be in the communique. There might be a little fuss in square brackets about how soon, how many specific countries are actually going to really promise to do it by and then get it done. But of all of the big tax havens that have really caused the problem, and we start in Europe and in the English challenge, right? They've already turned the tide. They've realized that their economic future is no longer here. I think the tough politics are going to come on beneficial ownership. Who really owns the company and who really is behind its business activities, and transparency on that, public registries, so everyone can see. That would do a lot to create market efficiency, as well as tax justice, as well as control any laundering and terrorist finance. So that's another win-win-win, and I do think that there is enough momentum behind the tax justice agenda that I'd be fairly optimistic. Certainly, you know, the first 7 steps of the OECD program, but real momentum so we can be sure by the time we get to Turkey that the next 8 will already be done.
Okay, let's go over here.
Pavel Vanishkin, TASS News Agency, the Russian one. I've got a question to anybody who would like to answer. It's about the G20 status, or if quote you say about G20 credibility. You know, in July G20 trade ministers meeting, they issued a statement and they called for the liberalization of the world trade. Basically, at the same time, some countries imposed sanctions against Russia. Russia tried to retaliate with the sanctions. And I'm not asking about who's right and who's wrong, but wouldn't be A, if they do sanctions against each other, B, it would be honest for them just to issue a statement that said that G20 is not the organization to handle such issues as the world trade liberalization.
Sanctions versus liberalized trade. Who, John, I see you leaning forward.
Well, you're certainly right. Liberalized trade creates global growth. Sanctions, protectionism in another form, inhibit global growth. And we're feeling that in Germany, both its eastern and western parts, and in Poland, and in the Baltic countries, and above all in Russia now, because it's unleashed this spiral of sanctions versus sanctions. I guess it would be easier if you were a trade policy purist to just say we're all going to take them off right away. But of course, then the question is, why were those sanctions imposed in the first place? So here I think we do have to get to the root causes of it. And certainly outside of Russia, we have observed the Russian Federation imposing protectionist measures, right, for some years now. Several years ago, when we went yet again to Moscow, we found that we could suddenly no longer buy Georgian wines there. Apparently, something had happened to them, so the health and safety standards of the Russian Federation were not being met. And then, of course, countries outside the Russian Federation can always, for political or other reasons, do similar things. On trade policy in general, it is possible to do better. This takes us back to an earlier question. There's at least one member country of the G20 that, in the face of the worst recession since the Great Depression, unilaterally cut its tariffs, its import tariffs, 3 times in a row to produce free trade on the import side in the entire manufacturing sector. That was Canada, led by Mr. Harper, right? So you can, at times, do it unilaterally for your own good. But an economics textbook that mentions the word spillovers, no, that let's call it concerted unilateralism, right? I do it, you do it at the same time, and because the spill-offers, we're both better off, and so are our neighbors too. So I think doing the 1,000 liberalizations, if you will, or the trade liberalization components of the 1,000 commitments all together, bundled together, is the best way to do it. So we're really looking for Australia to actually remove its restrictions on coastal shipping so it'll be easier for Australians to buy cheaper food.
Okay, first we'll go here, and then we're going to go back there. So, fellow in the light blue shirt.
Niall Coburn from Reuters. I just want to ask you, in relation, to tax evasion, it's been addressed in a very simple way, in the sense of, on the one hand, that you've mentioned just before, you've got the automatic exchange of information. But what they seem to be saying is it's in relation to the corporate tax effectiveness, where if you have a corporate, you should pay the tax where you make the money. The trouble is, and this is what I'm asking you about, is that we live in a world with international legal advice, legal structures, which have been in place for quite some time. And I just think that it's going to be a very hard hill to climb to implement such what I think is a very simple idea when you look at the international complexities involved.
Go ahead, Tom, do you want to tackle this? Or
start? But I mean, I think your point's very valid. I think what's being tackled right now is the easy part of it, which is increased transparency, automatic exchange of information. The problem, as you say, is structures have changed, tax laws have not changed to keep up with that. And when you have companies operating around the world as they do today, we're going to need to have developed rules of the game that countries agree to that can then be imposed. And we're not there yet. I mean, some have suggested we really need a world tax body or authority that would provide a forum by which countries could discuss first and then negotiate what the appropriate rules would be. Until we get that point, you're going to have countries either trying to impose their own views or confronting a situation where they're powerless to act. But so I think what has been done is important. It's a first step, but there's a much bigger step that has to come.
I would just add that what's interesting here is that tax avoidance is completely legal, right? I mean, they're using the actual legal and accounting standards that have been set, and they're playing by the book. The reality is, as Tom said, we need to change the rules of the book completely. It cannot be that it's acceptable that companies can pay as low as 1% to 2% of profits when personal income tax is as high as 34–40% in many OECD countries. I mean, there's just something fundamentally wrong with that. And again, I'd say all G20 countries, none of them have really marketed themselves as tax havens per se. So none of them are really gaining from this system. So it's incumbent on them, and I think in their best interest, to do something about changing the rules of the game. Now, of course, that is a larger ideological debate about, whether, companies do trickle down their wealth eventually. And I think that it may take some, political persuasion in many of the more, many of the European countries and many of the Western countries to really change their philosophy on that. More and more, we have evidence that it's not enough just to have macroeconomic growth. The World Bank and the IMF are finally behind this idea of inclusive growth, which is the idea that it's not enough to have macroeconomic growth if it doesn't actually make its way to the people. And so that, I think, is starting to change the sentiment of the way we think about profit sharing. But it's definitely going to take time. I think many of us as analysts would sit back and we're hoping that that's where many of the emerging market economies in developing countries would play a lead role, really sort of proposing these kind of pro-poor growth strategies that could be used to change the rules of the game. But so far, I think we're just still at the stage of discovery. And this is not to say that automatic exchange of information and so forth isn't useful. It's just we're too early in the process to really see this come to the fruition of a really equitable tax regime.
John.
I'd be optimistic. Ireland, to its credit, has just seen the light and is not going to be known as the double Irish anymore. But I think there's two bigger problems. The first, let me use a North American example. A really big American burger chain has just bought a little Canadian one so they can shift its headquarters, good news for Canada, and its profit Book it in Canada, where the tax rate on corporations is much lower than in the United States. Our friends in the U.S. Congress have noticed and wonder if they need to take some legislative action to stop that. I think it's called offshoring, you know, the corporate headquarters version. But it does raise the question, what is the appropriate level of corporate tax among the G20 countries and those beyond? So a next generation challenge for G20 governance is to come to some kind of more harmonized regime or understanding of that. We could all race to the bottom otherwise. The second, and Bessma alluded to it, the MMCs can do that no problem, pay 1 or 2 or 3 tax %. But the poor small and medium-sized enterprises, they can't. So the little guys pay tax of 30%. The big boys get 1 or 3. We know that about 95% of the new jobs come from the small and medium-sized enterprises and the young entrepreneurs. I think we would want to grow them just to get more jobs, a core priority for Mr. Abbott, right? So I think in the interests of income equality, the corporate tax version, right, you really do need to act more aggressively than perhaps they've realized, or to connect those two agenda items.
All right, and we had a question right there.
Hi, Andrew White from the Australian newspaper. Alongside the G20 presidency this year, Australia's also been negotiating 3 free trade agreements, and I'm just wondering where you think they sit inside this sort of G20 agenda. Should they be part of the growth plan? How do you see them?
I think the whole question of trade liberalization is one which the G20 has not come to grips with. Of course, if you go back through all the communiques, every year there's a strong statement that's saying we encourage the conclusion of the Doha development round, we support implementation of the Bali Agreement. As we know, that was agreed a year ago. It got thrown off by India. The U.S. and India have come to a deal which would allow India to agree to it going ahead by the United States declaring a truce for a specified time frame. We'll see where the other G20 countries are on that. But I guess it's a positive development, but we're just going back to where we were a year ago. We've really not moved the yardstick. The broader question is how do all of these plurilateral, bilateral trade agreements fit into a global trading system? And like a number of observers have noted that this is a growing problem, that the plethora of rules associated with each of these agreements, in fact, may be trade impeding rather than trade enhancing. And there's a need to come to grips with it. And the G20, the WTO certainly is not coming to grips with it yet, even though technically every agreement has to be submitted to the WTO for approval. They've never rejected one. But the G20 hasn't come to the rhetoric is there, but the practical reality of what do we really mean is not there, because the domestic politics of bilateral and plurilateral agreement seems to be more convenient for the moment.
John, you want to weigh in?
Very quickly, on the trade agenda of the G20, one of the most impressive things Mr. Abbott did, to be commended, is when he came to his trade objectives, he did not say, number one, we're finally going to get DOA done by this year or that year or by whatever. I think he recognized reality. It's pretty clear that this is a parrot that is really dead. He's going to say, I'm going to take real trade liberalization right here, right now, unilateral, bilateral, plurilateral, and we Canadians, it warmed our hearts. So did our friends in the European Union. We've just concluded our big deal with the European Union, the largest marketplace in the world. So we look with envy because Andrew Robb, really impressively, he's got his with Japan. We don't yet, right? And China, I think that's going to be announced, right? The big comer. So I think this is one of the areas in which we can all be really inspired by Australian leadership, because they're not just talking the talk in the communique, they're really walking it, or I would say running with it ahead of the rest of the group. I hope it will inspire Barack Obama and his new Congress to actually get their deal with the European Union done. And once we've got things all together across the Atlantic, we can look across the Pacific, and not just at the TPP, right? But the TPP with, well, maybe China, Korea, right? There's others who would like to join. That's what the B20 says we ought to do, and I think we need to listen more to them on that.
All right, I'd like to take a question from Wang Wen of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University.
Thank you, Fred. I have questions to John and Tom. And as a think tank scholar in China, we did a lot for the G20 host in China. But the problem is China, yes, now, yesterday we have the host. But the problem is in the coming 2 years, China, government or as well as those think tank or society now will very, very busy for prepare for the summit. So my questions to two of you, my dear colleagues and excellent think tank scholars all over the world about G20 researchers, it's that what's the functions of a think tank for the G20 summit, and how do the think tank in the China or all over the world to influence the G20 summit as a host in the coming years? Thank you.
What can think tanks do to influence the G20? What's the role, Tom?
Well, let me start, and John will carry on. I think in a couple of years ago, CIGI think tank I'm associated with, Fred Bessma, launched an initiative to create think tank, Think 20 is called, which was a grouping of think tanks around the world which were doing research on issues either which are currently subject to the agenda of the G20 or which people argue should be, such as climate change. We were, and this grew out of an informal grouping of think tanks that CIGI had constructed before, where informally we were providing information. I guess at the Mexican summit in Los Cabos was the first time during that year where the Mexicans actually moved to formalize the process and created a formal Think 20 where representatives from think tanks in each of the G20 countries came and met during the course of the year and provided the results of the outputs from their research to suggest agenda items or ways of approaching issues. That was then further pursued during the Russian presidency and again this year during the Australian presidency. So it's an attempt to draw out the best of what either what think tanks are doing, and it's part of a broader process of, the Australians use the term engagement groups, but it's a way to tap into the broader community and to get ideas. So I think it's now firmly entrenched within the G20 broader network. So the question, clearly is how do think tanks, and obviously there are a number of think tanks in each country, so how do they mobilize together to ensure that there is the broadest possible representation? But John, you may want to add.
Let me just highlight two. We would not have had a G20 summit back in the autumn of 2008 had it not been for 5 causes. But one of those causes was the good work one think tank did in the years before 2004 in making the case throughout the G20 countries, including importantly in George Bush's United States, that you really did need to raise the ministerial G20 up to the leaders' level. So in that crisis-ridden moment, the analytic case had been made, and it was the G20 that got the nod to cope with it. And George Bush, who had been the last holdout, right, said not only I'm going to choose the G20, but I want to host it as well. By the way, the think tank that was in the lead on that is, and I'm not affiliated with it, it was CIGI, right? Tom was, and others are. Those are just the facts. Secondly, flash forward to London, 2009, widely acknowledged to be, and properly, the most successful summit of all time, in part because of that stunning announcement, $1.1 trillion in new money, right? That was the headline, including about a quarter of it in special drawing rights at the IMF. Well, whose bright idea was that, of course, we asked. Tough to figure out, because all good ideas, you know, have far more parents than one would ever have known before. But two stand out. One, of course, was the government of China, and it's a real important step in China's leadership in G20 governance. The Chinese central bank governor, right, went public with it. And that signaled to everybody that China was on board, right? That really helped. But the other, at an earlier stage, was a small group of think tanks meeting in London with some wise folk. CIGI was there, but so was an American think tanker who was also a very influential person in the U.S. Treasury, right? And their inner and outer system, you know, think tankers, 1 year assistant Treasury secretaries the other year. So they were the ones that made the analytic case for it, but also convinced the U.S. Treasury Secretary right to go for it, the SDRs. So Tom may add another few names, but I think it's Ted Truman of the Peterson Institute, which is the one we'll have to disclose in the interest of transparency on that one. So think tankers have done a lot, not just at the margins, right, but at the core of G20 summit level governance. And that's a very high standard, so we're counting. We have high expectations for China's year as host.
We have time for one more quick question, and I just want to point out that all of these experts are available here throughout the day, including after the communique comes out, and their contact information is on the news releases that I have here in front of me or that was issued earlier. So if you want to follow up with any of John, Bessma, and Tom, you can do so at any time this afternoon. I'd like to recognize the fellow at the back there for the last question.
I'd like to ask anyone who could give me explanation. The 2% target of this G20 meeting, could anyone make connection between that target and poor people in some members of the G20 like China, India, Indonesia? They have heaps of poor people with a standard of living less than $2 per day. In other words, what does it mean for them, this result, if you can say result of the G20 meeting? Thank you.
Thanks, and if you wouldn't mind just stating your name and affiliation.
Oh, sorry, Hari Baskara from Kompas, Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. So the 2% and what it means for equality. John, do you want to?
Yeah, very quickly. Core mission of the G20 is to make globalization, including global growth, work for the benefit of all, everyone. So it is true that economic growth, a rising tide, lifts all boats, but these days it seems to lift all yachts before it lifts the boats at the bottom first. And this point is just not an empirical observation. It's from people who worry about income distribution or people who believe in starting with equality of outcomes rather than opportunities. We know now from the impressive research of the best folk at the International Monetary Fund, Jonathan Ostry, to name names, and now the OECD, trained with the best PhDs at the University of Chicago, that if you reduce income inequality, that is a source, a cause of greater economic growth in a sustainable and balanced way. So if you want strong, sustainable, balanced growth, the IMF, the hardcore, the most sophisticated economists will tell you, you've got to reduce income inequality. So I just hope that these G20 governors will actually just look at the evidence, and Christine Lagarde is there to share it with them, so is Angel Gurria.
Go ahead. Just add that I talked in my remarks about the 2010 IMF projections and their package that was to enhance growth. I think the numbers they suggested that had that package been implemented, 20 million people would have been lifted out of poverty. So I think that puts a specific number on it. Broader growth will deal with unemployment. It will lift people out of poverty. That's why we need it. But I mean, the 2% doesn't mean every country does 2% more. I mean, obviously, the target is global growth 2% greater than what it otherwise would have been. But I think at the end of the day, it's you know, we shouldn't get fixated. Is it 2.1, 2.3? It's sizable. The question is, are the commitments that are set out today specific, credible? Is there a clear collective commitment by leaders to ensure that it gets done to the maximum degree? And I think that's really the test. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. Good luck in covering the communique when it emerges this afternoon. If anyone is interested in Chinese think tank perspectives on the G20, there's an event tonight at 7:30 at Diana Plaza here in Brisbane. You can get the details from Wang Wen. And I also encourage you to read the releases that have been left on the chair about the Munk School G20 Research Center's compliance report, measuring compliance of G20 countries with previous initiatives. And you can find out more about that from the Munk School. Thank you for coming, and good luck in your coverage.